So you want to have an event grid send events to an Entra, previously known as Azure AD, protected endpoint. You might have even read this article from Microsoft explaining how to do it, but perhaps it's still not entirely clear. In this video, I'm going to break this down into step-by-step instructions so you can understand how it works and how to do it yourself, using the example of an Entra-Protected function app. So let's begin. Firstly, here are the steps we're going to follow to get this working. Step 1. Create an event grid and an HTTP triggered function app to receive events. Only webhook type event subscriptions can deliver events to Entra-authenticated endpoints, and I'm going to be using Entra-authentication here. So I'm making this an HTTP triggered function with authorization level anonymous. We'll take a look at the code for this later. Step 2. Set the function app up with Entra-authentication. Step 3. Create an app registration role and make myself and the Microsoft.EventGrid application a member of that role. So those are the steps. Now let's start with step 1. Creating an event grid and HTTP triggered function to receive the events. I'm going to show these steps fast forwarded because the settings here don't really matter for the purposes of this video. Here I'm creating an event grid with the default values. Now I'm creating a function app, in my case with a .NET 6 in-process runtime. Here's the function app code I'm using. As you can see from the code, to get an event grid from an HTTP triggered function, you simply need to pass the event from the body of the HTTP request. And you also need to handle the subscription validation handshake. This works similarly for cloud events, except the validation handshake uses an HTTP options request instead. Now let's create a subscription for the function. And let's give it a test. I'm going to use this console app to publish an event to the event grid. And now we wait patiently for a minute and see that the function app writes the event to the application insights log. That's step 1 complete. Now on to step 2, setting up Entra-authentication for the function app. Firstly, we go into the function app's authentication area and click Add Identity Provider. And we choose Microsoft. You can use an existing app registration if you like, but I'll create a new one here. I'm only going to allow requests from this Azure tenant. I'm going to allow requests from specific client applications, and here I'm going to enter the Microsoft.EventGrid application ID. This appears to be a GUID which is fixed by Microsoft, and you can search for it in Entra ID if you like. I'm going to require authentication for all requests and return 401 unauthorized when it gets an unauthenticated request. Now let's try sending another event and confirm that it fails to deliver. As you can see, the event has failed to deliver because the function app now requires Entra-authentication. So let's move on to step 3, creating the app role and granting permissions to that role. To add a role, let's go back to the function app authentication screen and click on this link on the identity provider. Now let's go to app roles and click create app role. We'll create an app role called Azure Event Grid Secure Webhook Subscriber and allow users and applications to be a member of this role. Note that this role has to have this exact name or you'll get an error looking something like this when trying to create the subscription, which basically tells you that you either have to be an owner of the app registration or the app registration has to have a role with this exact name, Azure Event Grid Secure Webhook Subscriber, and you must be assigned to this role. To assign myself to this role so that I can create the event grid subscription with this function app as a target, I will go to the overview then click the link next to Managed Application in Local Directory. Now I'll go to Users and Groups and click Add User/Group. I'll select my user and click Select. See that the selected role is Azure Event Grid blah 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 that I created a minute ago. Now I'll click Assign. Now we need to make the built-in Microsoft.EventGrid application a member of this role. To my knowledge, this can't be done in the UI, so we're going to run some PowerShell in the Azure Cloud Shell. You could find a link to this PowerShell in the description. If I put in my tenant ID, the object ID of the app registration for the function app, and the role ID of the Azure Event Grid Secure Webhook subscriber role, all of which can be found within the app registration for the function app, then run this script, this will assign the Microsoft.EventGrid application to the role for my app registration. Now let's delete the original EventGrid subscription which no longer works due to the newly added Entra-Authentication requirement on the function app. And let's create a new subscription which uses Entra-Authentication. To do that, we set the subscription up the same as before, except in the Additional Features tab of the setup, we check the Use AAD Authentication box and enter the tenant ID and application ID of the app registration we created for the function app. Now let's create the subscription. As you can see, the deployment has succeeded, so let's send a test event. After waiting a minute, you can see that the event is logged by the function app to the application insights log, proving that the function has received the event and therefore the subscription is now working. So there you have it, an event grid delivering to an Entra-Protected function app. Please like the video if you found it useful, and let me know if there are any other Azure related topics you'd be interested in seeing me cover next. Bye for now.